Welcome to Toon My Heart. Yes, that's Toon as in cartoon. Because in this podcast, we'll be taking a closer look at popular animated movies through a Christian lens, in search of faith-relevant themes and traces of eternal truth. I'm your host, Tracy Herold. And just a disclaimer, I'm not a Bible scholar, nor am I a film scholar. I'm just an animation fan who loves Jesus, and who wants to explore how the themes and ideas presented in some of my favorite films might resonate with the Christian faith and help remind us of what we believe, in sometimes surprising ways. So I hope you'll join me as we get animated about our faith. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Toon My Heart. It is finally fall, my friends, and while for many people that means pumpkin spice everything, others know that the real flavor of autumn is apple. Yes, 'tis the season for apple picking, bobbing for apples, apple pies, caramel apples, apple cider, and more. So what better time than now to talk about the Disney animated short, The Legend of Johnny Appleseed. The Legend of Johnny Appleseed was first released as part of Melody Time, the 10th animated feature film from Walt Disney Studios, a musical anthology film featuring 7 segments set to popular and folk music, which hit theaters back in 1948. And if you're interested in watching The Legend of Johnny Appleseed and you have Disney+, that is how you can find this short. Just search for Melody Time, and then if you want to go straight for this short, fast forward just a little bit. It's the 3rd one in the anthology, I believe. It's only about 17 minutes long, but that actually makes it the 2nd longest segment in the movie. It was later re-released as a standalone short in late 1955 under the shortened title, Johnny Appleseed. And I believe I saw it in that form growing up, probably on the Disney Channel, as I did have vague recollections of it prior to rewatching it recently for this podcast. It would also be included in 3 DVD releases in the 2000s: Disney's American Legends, Walt Disney's It's a Small World of Fun, and Walt Disney Animation Collection Classic Short Films. The Legend of Johnny Appleseed was narrated by Dennis Day, an American actor, comedian, and singer, who also performed all of the voices, including both Johnny and his guardian angel. And it features 5 songs, the first and longest of which is The Lord is Good to Me. And that is really what stood out to me as a modern viewer revisiting this short, although, to be honest, I really didn't remember this aspect from when I saw the film as a kid. Maybe at that age, it just didn't strike me as anything unusual. But as we've talked about on this podcast before, it's pretty rare for Disney to even bring up God or Christianity, especially nowadays. Yet here in 1948, we had a Disney short featuring a character singing a song thanking the Lord for his goodness, carrying a Bible, having encounters with a guardian angel, and eventually dying and going to heaven. I guess you could say it's definitely a product of a different time. Now let's get our kid's eye view synopsis of the film from Darcy, age 9. Hi, Darcy.
Hi.
Can you tell us about what happens in Johnny Appleseed?
So Johnny Appleseed's just collecting apples. And then an angel came and told him what things you can make out of apples.
Apples? What kind of things can you make out of apples?
Apple cider, apple pie, apple pickles.
Apple pickles?
That's what I heard.
I know. Do you think you would eat apple pickles?
I mean, I'm sure they're just an apple in a pickle jar.
You think so?
Yeah.
Okay.
So maybe I will.
All right. Well, what else?
Apple cake, apple
Apple sass?
What?
He says apple sass. What do you think that is?
I don't know.
I think he's saying applesauce in a funny way. Think so?
Okay.
Okay. All right, so then what does Johnny decide to do?
Grow apple trees?
He decides to go out and plant apple trees
Yeah.
in the wilderness?
Yeah.
Okay, and then what happens while he's planting the apple trees?
Just making friends with the animals?
Mm-hmm. Right, and then what happens after that?
They grow?
What grows?
The apple trees?
Okay, and then what happens?
He grows older.
Uh-huh.
He grows beard.
Uh-huh. What happens at the end of the movie?
He dies.
He dies. Where does he go when he dies?
Heaven.
Mm-hmm. All right, out of all the apple things that they talked about, what one do you think looks the tastiest?
I would say apple cake.
Yeah, that sounds good, huh?
Yeah, frosting and apple cake.
Yeah. I like apple pie.
Yesterday I tried apple pie. No.
Did it have whipped cream on it?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it still wasn't good?
Yeah, it still wasn't good.
Oh, okay. Well, if we find some apple pickles, we'll have to try some, right?
I guess.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Darcy.
Bye.
On the surface, it doesn't seem like there's much in the Legend of Johnny Appleseed for Christians to object to. After all, it's one of the most open and positive portrayals of Christianity that you'll find in pretty much any film made by Disney, with a man venturing out by faith carrying a Bible, making a positive impact on the world through kindness, and even going to heaven at the end. But it's also the first film I've covered that is based, however loosely, on actual historical people and events. And I think that should affect how we approach it as Christians to some extent. We are, after all, supposed to love and value truth. And while that doesn't mean we can't enjoy fictional portrayals of history, I think it's important that we think critically about what those portrayals are showing us and how well they reflect reality, or obscure or distort it. So first of all, let's take a few minutes to talk about the real Johnny Appleseed, born John Chapman on September 26, 1774, in Leominster, Massachusetts. After apprenticing under an orchardist, John Chapman embarked on a canoe voyage with his seeds in 1806, beginning the lifelong journey that would lead him to introduce apple trees to large parts of Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, West Virginia, and Ontario. While some depictions give the idea of him just randomly scattering seeds wherever he walked, and the Disney short appears to portray him planting orchards, he actually planted fenced-in nurseries, meaning his trees were intended to be sold and transplanted elsewhere. According to historian Paul Aaron, quote, Chapman was actually a successful businessman. He bought many of the parcels of land on which he planted his seeds, and ultimately accumulated about 1,200 acres across 3 states. He wore pauper's clothing by choice and not out of necessity. End quote. So yes, the depiction of John wandering around in ragged clothes, barefoot, and with a pan on his head does appear to be accurate from all accounts at least. Also, despite all of the delicious pies and other apple-based treats shown and sung about in the Disney short, John's apples were probably not actually used much for eating, but rather for making cider, and not the type of cider that Baptists would approve of, if you know what I mean. That's because the wild apples he grew would likely have been small and tart. In fact, he was opposed to grafting, the practice that has cultivated the varieties of more palatable apples that we all enjoy eating today. In addition to being a frontiersman, nurseryman, and businessman, John Chapman was also a missionary. In fact, if you Google Johnny Appleseed, right at the top of the results page, it will say American missionary. But specifically, he was a missionary for something called the New Church, or Swedenborgianism, which was founded not by the Muppets' Swedish chef, as you might guess, but rather by a man named Emanuel Swedenborg. And Swedenborg, kind of like Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, claimed to have received special revelations from spiritual beings about what all of the other Christian churches were supposedly getting wrong. So, suffice it to say, Swedenborgianism has some significant differences from traditional Orthodox Christian beliefs. For instance, Swedenborg rejected 32 of the 66 books of the Bible, including all of the epistles in the New Testament. He also rejected the Trinity and the doctrine of justification by faith alone, among other traditional Christian beliefs and ideas. Now, I'm not one to quibble with fellow Christians about minor doctrinal differences, but these are not minor. They're pretty major, really. And so sadly, I have to say I think it's somewhat doubtful that the gospel that John Chapman was spreading through the frontier was the true one. I think it's an important thing to recognize that whenever we see a depiction in any kind of media, not just animation, of an actual historical figure, the picture we're getting is probably rosier than reality, or at the very least incomplete. And so I think it is important to acknowledge that Johnny Appleseed was, in many ways, a good example to follow. He was known for his kindness to people and animals and for his conservationism. But also, we have to acknowledge that just labeling him as a Christian missionary doesn't really give a full, accurate picture of what he actually believed and taught. It would have been really convenient for me to ignore that in talking about this film, but I wanted to be honest. I think it's imperative for us, especially as Christians, not to gloss over the aspects of history that don't perfectly fit into a rosy picture of the past we might want to believe in and share with our kids. We can enjoy those rosy pictures, but I think we also need to say, here's the reality, here's the bad along with the good, and here's what we can learn from it. And speaking of rosy pictures, my other concern with this film is the very romanticized vision it presents of the westward expansion of the United States, and particularly of what relations between the white settlers and Native Americans looked like. The settlers heading west, including Johnny, are presented as heroic figures engaged in an unambiguously positive and even divinely ordained undertaking. And there is even a scene later in the short in which settlers and Native Americans are seen having a celebration, dancing and eating together, and they're described as being good neighbors to each other. I don't necessarily expect a Disney short to address the more complicated and often darker reality of what westward expansion and the treatment of Native Americans during that time actually looked like, but I think it is important as we watch a depiction like this to be aware of the reality that it's glossing over. And the reality is that the United States government failed to live up to the very words it was founded on, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, in its treatment of the men, women, and children who already inhabited the land it sought to expand into. And on a more individual basis, while it's possible there were settlers who treated the Native Americans as fellow human beings made in the image of God, they were likely the exception and not the rule. And so, on the whole, it's disingenuous, at least, to portray them as having been good neighbors who would have been dancing and sharing food as equals. Again, I don't think it's necessarily wrong to watch and even enjoy an idealized version of events like this, as long as we do so with our eyes wide open and our critical thinking caps on. It's important that we understand that it is idealized, and make sure that our kids know that it is. Tell them this may be how we wish it had been, but then, in an age-appropriate way, be honest about how it really was. It's okay to teach them to love America and to be proud to be Americans, while also explaining that there are aspects of this country's history that we should not be proud of. Because, as the saying goes, if we don't remember and learn from history, actual history, not just romanticized media portrayals of it, we are doomed to repeat it. All of that said, ultimately this podcast is not about the real John Chapman, or even about the real history of the westward expansion of America, but rather it is about the fictionalized Disney version that we see in this cartoon. As the narrator says at the beginning of the short, reality has given way to legend. And the Johnny Appleseed of legend, the one portrayed in the short, is one who carries what looks like a pretty thick Bible, so I'm guessing it probably has all 66 books in it, whose apples are used to make pies and applesauce instead of hard cider, and who does inspire people to come together as good neighbors. And so, whatever lessons there might be to learn from the real Johnny and the historical reality he existed within, and I'm sure there are many, for the rest of the podcast, we are going to focus on the lessons we can take from the animated character of Johnny Appleseed. Now it's time, as always, to choose our theme Bible verse for this episode. There are a lot of verses in the Bible about sowing seeds and even some verses that mention apples, particularly in Proverbs and the Song of Solomon. But the Bible verse that this animated short really brought to mind for me, somewhat ironically because it's a verse that Swedenborg would have removed from his Bible, is 1 Corinthians 1:27. But God has chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. God has chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty. Why this verse? Because right from the beginning of the short, Johnny and the tools that he uses are shown to be in contrast with things which are mighty. The narrator starts by telling us, on the pages of American folklore, a legion of mighty men have left the symbols of their greatness. Paul Bunyan's axe, John Henry's hammer, Davy Crockett's rifle, and then, quite unexpectedly, one comes upon a tin pot hat, a bag of apple seeds, and a holy book. And strangely enough, these are the symbols of one of the mightiest men of all. Next to an axe, a hammer, and a rifle, Johnny's tools seem foolish. Next to these other giant men of American history and myth, Johnny seems weak. And yet, in this short, God chooses him and uses him. To find out how, let's dive into the rest of the short. The film begins in 1806 as Johnny is harvesting apples in an orchard in Philadelphia and singing "The Lord is Good to Me." Now, I haven't quite been able to get a definitive answer on where this song originated. In my research, some sources said it was a Swedenborgian hymn that predated the short, while others credited Kim Gannon and Walter Kent as having written it for the film. And none of them seem to cite primary sources where I felt like I found a definitive answer. So I really don't know. Maybe it was a Swedenborgian hymn and Gannon and Kent were responsible for this particular arrangement, or maybe they added to or changed the lyrics for the purposes of this short. Regardless, it is a really delightful little song in which Johnny praises God and recognizes his reliance on him for everything. Just a few verses down from our theme Bible verse is 1 Corinthians 1:31, which says, "Therefore, as it is written, let him who boasts, boast in the Lord." And that's exactly what Johnny does as he sings. He recognizes that God has given him everything that he needs, the sun and rain and the apple seed, and that he can trust God to care for him and for his trees day in and day out. He clearly enjoys and takes pride in his work, but he gives God the ultimate credit, singing, "I'm certain if it weren't for him, there'd be no apples on this limb." And he sings that he wakes up every day as happy as can be because of God's goodness. Johnny is clearly very content, but contentment is not the same as complacency. And as the narrator tells us, lately Johnny would feel a stir in the air, the rumbling, rolling beat of restless men with restless feet. And as he sees a caravan of pioneers heading west, singing their own song about heading out to the great unknown, Johnny begins to daydream about going along with them and being a pioneer himself. But these people are, in their own words, strong and hardy men. And Johnny, in contrast, is, as the narrator so eloquently puts it, just a sawed-off, scrawny little fella. Johnny's previously carefree, happy countenance falls as the narrator tells us that he doesn't see himself as capable of being a pioneer, and that those going west to build this nation made picking apples look useless. And look, comparing yourself to others and what they're doing is not fruitful, if you'll forgive the pun. Each of us has our own role to play, and none is more or less important than the others, as long as we're following what God has for us to do. But at the same time, if you feel a strong desire to do something more or different than what you're doing now, then maybe that's God calling you. And that appears to be the case with Johnny, as his guardian angel now appears to encourage him to follow his dream. So I guess we should pause for a moment and talk about guardian angels. There's no doubt that in the Bible, we see instances of God sending angels to protect people in certain situations. But when people use the term guardian angel, they're usually referring more specifically to this idea that each person has their own personal guardian angel who is watching over and protecting them at all times. There are some Christian traditions and denominations that believe that, and of course there are others that don't. It's not something that's really spelled out clearly in the Bible, but there are a few verses that those who do believe in guardian angels might point to, including Matthew 18:10, where Jesus said, "See that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I say to you that in heaven their angels always see the face of my Father in heaven." There's also Psalm 91:1 that says, "For he shall give his angels charge over you to guard you in all your ways," and Hebrews 1:14, which says of angels, "Are they not all ministering spirits sent out to minister to those who will inherit salvation?" I personally don't think that any of those verses necessarily points to each of us having our own private guardian angel, as the short puts it. But if you do, I think that's something that we as Christians can agree to disagree on. I think the most important thing that hopefully we can all agree on is that we remember that our hope and trust needs to be in God, and not in the angels, who are his messengers and servants, and are created beings just like we are. But all that said, Johnny's angel is certainly a fun character, looking very much unlike any other depiction of an angel you've probably ever seen, as he's dressed like a stereotypical pioneer man, right down to the coonskin cap. And he asks Johnny what's holding him back from going west if that's what he wants to do. Johnny's answer is, "I ain't got the muscle or the breadth of chest. There it's the strong men who survive, and I'm the puniest fella alive." And he adds also that all I know is apple trees. But the angel assures him that physical strength isn't what he really needs. As our theme verse tells us, God delights in using the weak to do his work. Because if a mighty man does something mighty, he'll likely be the one who gets credit for it. But when a weak man like Johnny does something meaningful, God can get the glory. The angel tells Johnny that he's got all the real strength that he truly needs: faith, courage, and a level head. When Johnny objects again, this time that he doesn't have the things he'll need out there, it kind of reminds me of Moses when he argued over and over with God, who was speaking to him out of the burning bush, telling God that he can't possibly be the right person for the job. And just like God telling Moses that his staff was all that he would really need, because ultimately God would be behind him, the angel tells Johnny that all he really needs is right there in front of him: his bag of apple seeds, the tin pot that will serve as both hat and cooking tool, and his Bible. Earlier, as I mentioned, these tools of Johnny's were contrasted with John Henry's hammer, Paul Bunyan's axe, and Davy Crockett's rifle. All weapons, or at least tools capable of causing great damage. And I think that's an interesting contrast, especially with Johnny's Bible, because while it may appear to be just a book, of course we know that it is a weapon in its own right. In Ephesians 6, Paul's famous armor of God passage, he says that the word of God is the sword of the Spirit. And the writer of Hebrews, whoever that may have been, makes a similar comparison. writing in chapter 4, verse 12, "For the word of God is alive and active, and sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even to the division of soul and spirit, of joints and marrow, and able to judge the thoughts and intents of the heart." So, with his Bible, tin pot, and bag of apple seeds in tow, Johnny is finally convinced to follow his dream and head west into the great unknown. The narrator tells us then that it was a mighty big, fierce place for a man to face, a little man and all alone, without no knife, without no gun, once again emphasizing Johnny's weakness and lack of any weapons. But Johnny is undeterred. He begins planting an orchard and is observed by the animals of the forest, who watch him with fear. But when a skunk approaches him and gets ready to spray him, instead of responding with fear or anger himself, Johnny begins petting it. And his unexpected kindness diffuses the situation, winning over not only the skunk, but all of the other animals. When we talk about God using the foolish and weak things of the world to confound those which are wise and those which are mighty, this is a great picture of that. Kindness, empathy, and love are often seen as foolishness and weakness. And yet, with God's help, they can be some of our greatest weapons. Johnny may have looked foolish and weak walking into a forest filled with wild animals without any gun or knife, but it was precisely because he didn't have those things that the animals ended up trusting and befriending him. I think that's a great lesson for us in how we approach other people, even and especially those who may not like us. This is why Jesus tells us to love our enemies, to turn the other cheek, and to walk the extra mile, to do what appears weak and foolish and upside down to the world. Because it's those weak and foolish acts of love that he can make the most use out of in winning people's hearts for him. As the story continues, we're told that Johnny makes friends everywhere, not just with animals, but with people as well, and becomes known for his faith, courage, and kindly deeds, not to mention, of course, his apples. We see Johnny looking in on a celebration in his honor, but we're told that he's not looking for thanks, and in fact, he doesn't have time for it. He knowed a man can't rest, the narrator tells us, if he aims to plant the wilderness in apple trees. His persistence calls to mind Galatians 6:9, "And let us not grow weary in doing good, for in due season we shall reap if we do not give up." Johnny's task, planting seeds, may not seem like much, but he is faithful in it, and he doesn't give up, and because of that, he has a big impact. We're told that over the course of 40 years, this little man throwed his shadow clear across the land, and in that shadow everywhere, he left his blessings three: God and faith and the apple tree. And at the end of those 40 years, we see Johnny sleeping, surrounded by his animal friends, and when his guardian angel appears again and summons him, Johnny arises and leaves his body, or his mortal husk, as the angel puts it, behind. At first, Johnny is upset. He can't be dead because he's still got so much work to do. But then the angel assures him that although his work on earth is through, they need him in heaven where there are no apple trees. Now, I don't think heaven will be lacking anything that we can add to it, including apple trees. But what about the idea that there will be work for us to do in heaven? I think that is biblical, because even before the fall, God gave Adam and Eve work to do, tending the Garden of Eden. The idea of working in heaven might sound unpleasant if you don't enjoy your work here on earth as much as Johnny Appleseed enjoyed his. But we have to remember that if our work now is difficult and wearisome, that's a result of the curse of sin, and that won't be a problem in heaven. As Randy Alcorn puts it in his book, Heaven, the work we'll have to do then will be satisfying and enriching work that we can't wait to get back to, work that'll never be drudgery. And so the short ends with the words of the song it began with, "The Lord is good to me." And he is good to us. He's good to allow us to serve him and to use us in all of our weakness to do good for him and for others. We began with Paul's words about how God has chosen the weak things of the world in his first letter to the Corinthians. By the end of his second letter to the same church, Paul made it clear that this wasn't just theoretical for him. It was something he was living out as he struggled with whatever weakness he referred to as his thorn in the flesh. He related how he asked God 3 times to take this thorn from him. Then in 2 Corinthians 12, 9 through 10, he writes, "But he said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness.' Therefore, most gladly will I boast in my weaknesses, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. So I take pleasure in weaknesses, in reproaches, in hardships, in persecutions, and in distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong." We probably all have something we could call our thorn in the flesh. Something that we feel holds us back or makes us less worthy or less capable than others. But whatever weaknesses or challenges you have, whatever limitations or difficulties, God can use you, and He can be glorified through you. Your weakness allows Him to be strong. So whatever He's called you to do, just be faithful in it and let His power shine through. Before I conclude this episode, I wanted to share with you about someone who I think really exemplifies this spirit of allowing God to use you to do good.
So today, my guest is Allison Bond, who is the founder of a ministry called Kindness Through Letters Mission Project. And so to start off with, Allison, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes. So, well, first of all, I was born at 25 weeks premature, and I have a vocal tick too. So just, so yeah, I was born at 25 weeks. I have mild cerebral palsy and some developmental issues. But yeah, so KTLM project was started during COVID, and I started writing just, like 5 or 6 letters at a time to prisoners and soldiers. And then I thought, might as well grow my ministry and make it bigger and encourage just anybody around the world that needs it and to spread God's love to them, because obviously this world today, it's full of negativity. So we definitely need more of God's love and all that, and that's what I am currently working on.
Okay. What inspired you to just start writing letters in the first place?
Yes, so my grandma used to send like Christmas cards, and she would always help a lot of people out with stuff, and I guess that really inspired me to like encourage people with that and help them out when they need it most. And so I handwrite every single letter and card that I write.
Wow.
And I've written like 4,000 letters, and I have 4,000 letters pretty much that are done and ready to go.
That's awesome. I'm just curious, does anyone ever write back to you?
Oh yeah, all the time. I keep every single response, and all of them have been really positive, especially to the prisoners. I never thought that God would do that. Like, God would use me to share encouragement with them.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I enjoy it. I now sit outside on my porch, and I think I worked like 3 hours straight on it this morning.
Wow, that's great. Where do you find out the addresses to send the letters to?
Facebook, anywhere, like local people that I know. And then I love to just write random prisoners from like all over the US.
So you're making an impact for God and sharing God's love with people really all over the world, I'm sure.
Oh, yes.
with just, pen and paper and stamps and envelopes.
Yeah.
So what advice would you give to someone who says, I want to serve God, or I want to, help tell people about him, but I don't know how to start, or I don't feel like I'm equipped for it? What would you say to them?
Definitely pray a lot about it and, seek his guidance and basically, say, God, I don't know where my place is, but I'm sure he knows exactly where somebody's purpose is.
Yeah, I think a lot of times we're held back because we look at what abilities or strengths we don't have, or what tools we don't have, instead of focusing on what abilities we do have and what tools we do have. And so I think it's awesome that you have found this way, that's very simple but very effective to reach out to people.
And easier.
But you didn't allow yourself to be held back by any sort of challenges that you might have physically or with your ability.
That's my goal, to not be held back, to just do it no matter what the outcome is.
Yeah, we're in charge of sowing the seeds and watering the soil, right? And then God is in charge of what happens from there.
Yeah.
Well, that's awesome. If people are interested in helping your ministry, are there any specific ways in which they can do that?
Yes, I will send you the link to my things where they can help support my ministry, because I have a list of items and I have several links and stuff.
So what kind of stuff do you need, like stamps and...
Yeah, definitely postage stamps. That's one thing I'm good on everything else but that. Though, and those get expensive, so.
Yeah, and the price keeps going up, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I asked before if you ever get letters back. If people do send you a letter back, do you ever then start a ongoing correspondence with them?
Yes. All the time.
How many people would you say you have an ongoing correspondence with?
I'd say probably, I don't know. I'd say probably 200, but
Wow.
that's mainly prisoners, but.
I think that's wonderful. I think a lot of people obviously look down on those members of society. And, if they have committed a crime, they do need to serve their time for it. But they also are human beings made in the image of God, and God loves them. And we need to tell them that.
Oh, yes.
So I think that's just an amazing ministry that you have found for yourself. And you write to soldiers too? Is that generally soldiers who are deployed, or?
Well, they're usually in boot camp, but that varies because I really don't know how many. Because I don't really stay in contact with them because obviously they get out of boot camp and go other places. But yeah, I'm enjoying it.
Well, I think what you're doing is amazing. And, I just think it's very inspiring and a great lesson for all of us that we don't need to be the strongest or the smartest or, what have you for God to use us. He can use us as we are. He designed us as we are. He knows,
Yes.
he knows exactly what we need to be to serve him. And we just need to look for those ways to serve. And I think you've found an awesome way to do that. And where can people find your ministry online?
Yes. So KTLM Project. If they look that up or they search my name in Lincoln, Arkansas, they would probably find me.
Okay. And I know you're on Facebook.
Yes.
Are you on any other social media?
Facebook is the main thing. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you again so much for your time and for sharing your ministry with us.
And I will send you that link as soon as I get done.
Awesome. I will make sure to include that in the show notes as well.
Yes. Thank you so much.
So that concludes this episode of Toon My Heart. A short film, but one that can give us a lot to think about and from many different angles. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you again to my guest, Allison Bond of Kindness Through Letters Mission Project. I hope that you'll check her out on Facebook. Please, if you haven't done so already, like and subscribe to the podcast wherever you're listening. Give it a rating or even a review. Your support means so much for this little podcast. Until next time, remember that God can use you if you will trust Him to.